They said the night she died, the air itself caught fire. In the small town of Willow Creek, Alabama, 1849, a single scream tore through the dark, high, guttural, and so raw it made dogs whimper for miles. Neighbors swore they saw light flickering from the Hensley farmhouse, though no flame ever touched the roof. Inside that dim, collapsing house, 14-year-old Clara Hensley was burning alive. Not from fire, but from within. Her skin glistened like candle wax under her fevered breath, her eyes glassy and unblinking, as her father begged the doctors to help her. But the men wouldn't come closer. One had seen her arm melt beneath his glove, flesh turning liquid, steaming, then vanishing into the sheets as if the bed itself were swallowing her whole. The air stank of sulfur and something far worse, something unnatural. They said it began 3 nights before she died, when Clara woke screaming that someone was inside her body, trying to claw their way out. No one believed her, not until her skin began to blister where no heat touched her. Her screams grew louder with each hour, echoing across the cold Alabama hills, until the whole town was afraid to sleep. And when she finally went silent, no one dared enter the house until sunrise. What they found inside would never be spoken of in daylight again, because Clara Hensley hadn't just died. She had melted, vanished, and left behind something that still moved when the morning light touched it. In the spring of 1849, when the air in Alabama carried that thick scent of damp earth and pine, the Hensley farmhouse sat quietly on the edge of Willow Creek, until the night the girl began to scream. Clara Hensley had always been the quiet one, a pale slip of a child who preferred to sketch the forest trees in her notebook rather than play with the neighbors' children. But in early March, her father, Elias, noticed something strange. Her skin had grown unnaturally warm, like she'd been sitting too close to the fire, though she hadn't left her room. At first, they thought it was a fever, the kind that comes with the southern heat. But this was something else entirely. Her temperature climbed higher by the hour, beads of sweat pooling on her neck, her lips trembling as if she were holding back a cry. Then came the night she woke screaming. Not the sound of pain, but of something deeper, primal, as though the terror was being pulled from her very bones. The first scream shattered the stillness of the Hensley home, startling her father awake. Her stepmother, Ruth, rushed to her bedside, only to recoil at the heat radiating from Clara's body. It wasn't humanly possible. The air around her shimmered faintly, like heat rising from a blacksmith's forge. Elias soaked cloths in cool water and pressed them to her forehead, but the water sizzled, evaporating before it even touched her skin. By dawn, Clara was too weak to speak, her breathing shallow and raspy, her bedsheets damp with sweat and something that looked too thick, too dark to be water. Her eyes darted toward the corner of the room, following something no one else could see, her mouth trembling as she whispered, "It's coming from inside me." The next day, Elias rode 30 miles to fetch a doctor from Tuscaloosa, desperate for help. Dr. Emmett arrived by nightfall, his boots caked in mud, his expression grim as soon as he entered the room. The smell hit him first, a sweet, burnt odor that lingered in the air. He pressed a gloved hand to Clara's wrist, and for a moment, she seemed calm. Then her skin shifted beneath his fingers, blistering instantly, the flesh bubbling like wax. He yanked his hand back in horror, the glove's leather smoking where it had touched her. Without a word, he stepped away, muttering something about unnatural heat and refusing to return. Elias begged, but the man mounted his horse and rode off into the dark, his face pale with fear. 2 more doctors came over the next few days, one from Marion, another from Greensboro, both leaving just as quickly, each with the same look of dread after seeing her. The second doctor, a younger man named Turner, said he'd seen fever before, but nothing that could boil the air around a patient. He claimed it wasn't sickness, it was something unholy. By then, word had spread through Willow Creek that the Hensley girl was cursed. The townsfolk whispered that her mother, before she died, had dabbled in alchemy, mixing metals and salts in secret experiments late into the night. Some said she had tried to capture the essence of fire itself, a dangerous act of hubris that could have doomed her child. Each night, Clara's screams returned, longer and more haunting, echoing through the hills until the animals in the woods grew silent. The neighbors stopped visiting. Ruth refused to enter the room. Only Elias remained, his hands trembling as he sat by her bedside, praying for mercy while the room grew hotter, the candles bending from the waves of invisible heat. And as the fever took hold of her completely, Clara's eyes glazed over, and her body began to shine faintly, as though light were leaking through her skin, warning that something inside her was no longer human, and that whatever had begun in that farmhouse would not end quietly or mercifully for anyone who stayed to witness it. By the third night, the house no longer felt like a home, but a furnace of dread. The sound of Clara's screams had become part of the air, vibrating through the walls until even the nails seemed to quiver. When her father sent word for help again, 3 doctors answered the call, one out of pity, one out of obligation, and one driven by the kind of curiosity that borders on madness. They arrived before dawn, their faces pale beneath the flickering lamplight, their voices hushed as if afraid to disturb something already awake. The moment they entered Clara's room, the heat hit them. Not the warmth of fever, but a suffocating, pulsing force, as though the very air were breathing. Clara lay motionless, her eyes open but unfocused, her hair clinging to her damp skin. The sheets beneath her shimmered faintly, and when one of the doctors reached to adjust them, his hand jerked back in pain. The fabric was burning hot, almost glowing from the inside. The eldest of the doctors, Dr. Horace Bell, insisted on examining her despite the warnings. He pressed a stethoscope to her chest, and the metal hissed instantly, the earpieces scorching his skin. When he pulled away, the chest piece had left a darkened mark on her body, and a thin wisp of smoke rose from it. His eyes widened, disbelief twisting into fear. He muttered something about spontaneous combustion, but the words didn't seem to fit what they were witnessing. Dr. Marin, the second physician, leaned closer to observe the strange sheen forming over her skin, a wet, translucent layer that seemed to pulse with each weak heartbeat. He reached out with his bare hand, brushing the edge of her forearm, and the flesh beneath his fingers began to liquefy. It wasn't blood or sweat that came out, but something thicker, golden and viscous, sliding down her arm like molten wax. Marin stumbled back, his voice cracking as he shouted for water. But even as they poured it over her, the liquid hissed and evaporated before touching her skin. None of the men could explain it. There was no infection, no rational illness, only heat and decay without flame. Dr. Bell, trembling, declared that no natural cause could make flesh dissolve like that. The third doctor, a younger man named James Whitlock, refused to stay another moment. He claimed the girl's body wasn't reacting, it was transforming, and that whatever she had could spread. He threw down his gloves, demanding payment before fleeing the house. Bell and Marin remained only a little longer, driven by a mixture of fascination and horror, scribbling notes that trembled with every stroke. Bell whispered to Elias that it was as if her body were being consumed from the inside out by something unseen, an invisible fire turning her organs to ash without burning her clothes or the bed. Elias, wild with desperation, begged them to try again, to do anything, bloodletting, cooling, prayer, but the doctors refused to touch her. Marin's fingers still bore the faint burns where her skin had melted beneath his touch. They stepped away slowly, their eyes darting toward the door as the temperature in the room climbed higher, their breath turning shallow from the heavy air. And then, just before they left, Clara's eyes flicked open, glassy and unfocused, but somehow aware. She looked directly at the men and whispered something so faint that only Elias heard. "It's not my fire." Her words froze them all. The air seemed to tighten, and for a moment, the faint glow beneath her skin flared brighter, spreading across her arms and neck like veins of light. The doctors stumbled out, muttering prayers, too terrified to look back as Elias fell to his knees beside his daughter, his tears evaporating before they reached the floor, his heart breaking as he realized that whatever was consuming her was beyond medicine, beyond reason, and perhaps even beyond the mercy of God. By the time the third doctor fled into the night, the whispers had already begun spreading through Willow Creek like a fever of their own. The townspeople spoke of Clara Hensley not as a girl anymore, but as an omen. The story twisted with each retelling. Some said she was possessed, others that she'd been touched by hellfire for sins her family had never confessed. The name Hensley had long carried unease in the town, ever since Clara's mother, Abigail, died under strange circumstances 2 years before. Abigail had been a quiet woman, but curious in ways that unsettled her neighbors. She was known to spend long hours in the barn with her books and jars of colored powder, performing what she called experiments in alchemy. People said she was trying to transmute elements, that she believed she could turn the essence of life itself into something everlasting. Most dismissed her as an eccentric widow, but a few swore they'd seen the barn glow faintly some nights, a blue shimmer like lightning crawling under the door. When the barn caught fire one summer morning, the flames burned white, and when it was over, nothing remained of Abigail's work but glass-like ashes fused to the floorboards. No one spoke of it again until Clara began to burn from within. Now, as the doctors refused to help, the townspeople A.S. Fear found an easy explanation. Clara's suffering was her mother's sin come home to roost. They said Abigail's experiments had opened something unnatural, that the spirit of what she tried to summon had found its way into her daughter's blood. Elias heard these whispers when he rode into town for supplies, the shopkeeper refusing to meet his eyes. Mothers pulled their children off the street when he passed. Even the preacher, Reverend Lyle, kept his distance, claiming the Lord's hand would not touch what science and sin had already claimed. Elias's desperation began to harden into fury, but when he returned home each night, the sight of his daughter's body glowing softly in the dark made his anger falter into despair. Inside the farmhouse, Ruth had started marking crosses on the doors, sprinkling salt along the windowsills, muttering prayers under her breath. She told Elias they needed to leave, to take Clara far from the town and bury her illness in the wilderness before it consumed them all. But Elias couldn't leave her. Every time he looked at her face, fevered and glistening with a faint golden sheen, he thought he could still see traces of Abigail. The same delicate nose, the same calm brow, even as her skin began to warp and crack under invisible heat. Some nights, when the air outside turned cold and still, Clara would whisper her mother's name, her voice trembling with both fear and longing. Elias would sit beside her and stroke her hair, his fingers trembling as he felt how hot it had grown. The gossip deepened when the town's gravedigger claimed to see smoke rising from the Hensley property at midnight, though no fire burned. Others swore they saw lights flickering in the windows, moving shapes that weren't human. Someone recalled that before her death, Abigail had purchased mercury, sulfur, and strange mineral salts from a traveling trader, substances said to belong to the forbidden side of alchemy. They began to believe she hadn't died in the barn fire at all, but that she'd merged with whatever she was creating. And if that was true, then Clara's illness wasn't a sickness, but a continuation, a living inheritance of the curse her mother left behind. As the days passed, Elias found symbols scorched into the floor near Clara's bed, circles and patterns that seemed to shift slightly when he looked at them too long. He didn't remember carving them, and Ruth swore she hadn't either. When he tried to scrub them away, the wood burned his hands. Still, Clara grew weaker, her voice fading to a whisper, her skin glowing more brightly each night. And though Elias prayed and cursed and wept, a part of him began to believe what the town had whispered, that this was no fever of the body, but a haunting of the blood, a curse born not from sickness, but from a mother's terrible desire to command the fire of creation itself. The night Clara's screams reached their final pitch, the sky above Willow Creek turned a strange shade of red, as if the horizon itself were bleeding. The air was thick and heavy, and even the crickets had gone silent. Those who lived nearest to the Hensley farmhouse later said the light began just after midnight, flickering behind the windows like a candle trapped inside a jar. No one dared to go near it at first, but as the screaming grew louder, raw, unbroken, filled with something beyond pain, fear turned into a grim kind of duty. By the time the townspeople reached the house, a low vibration trembled through the ground, like the hum of something alive beneath the earth. Elias had not been seen for 2 days, and Ruth's frantic cries could be heard from the front porch before they even reached the gate. When they broke down the door, the heat that rolled out made several men stagger backward, their faces blistering from the blast of it. Inside, the house was dark, but a pulsing orange glow leaked from beneath Clara's bedroom door, illuminating the hallway with a ghostly shimmer. Ruth stood at the doorway, clutching her Bible so tightly the pages tore between her fingers. She was whispering prayers, her voice shaking, her eyes fixed on the door as if she feared it would open. The moment one of the men reached for the handle, it seared his palm, and the smell of burning flesh filled the hallway. Someone shouted to fetch water, but before anyone could move, the screaming stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. Even the air seemed to freeze, waiting. Slowly, the men pushed the door open with the end of a shovel, and what they saw inside silenced every living soul who entered. The walls were dripping, not with blood, but with a black tar-like substance that slid down in slow, thick streaks. The wooden floorboards were slick with the same material, bubbling faintly, as though still alive. The sheets on the bed were scorched, curling inward like dried leaves. But there was no fire, no smoke, and no sign of the girl except for a hollow outline burned into the mattress. Elias was slumped beside the bed, his face turned toward the wall, his hair wet with sweat, his body trembling but alive. When the men called his name, he didn't answer. His hands were blackened, his palms raw and cracked as though he had tried to hold something too hot to touch. Ruth dropped to her knees beside him, her voice breaking into sobs. But Elias didn't move. The smell in the room was unbearable, a mixture of sulfur, burned oil, and something far worse, something that made the stomach twist. One of the men opened a window, but even the night air refused to enter. It was as if the room itself had sealed shut, trapping what had happened inside. On the far wall, opposite the bed, there were marks, long, thin trails that looked like handprints, only melted into the plaster. The men backed away slowly, none daring to speak, until Ruth screamed again, pointing to the corner of the room. There, beneath the window, something was moving. At first it looked like a pool of liquid, black and glistening, but then it shifted, rippling, as if something beneath it was breathing. When one of the men stepped closer, the thing shuddered violently, releasing a hiss that made everyone flinch. It wasn't fire, but it radiated heat, pulsing with faint golden light. Someone shouted for them to leave, and they did, dragging Ruth and Elias from the house, slamming the door behind them, and vowing never to return. By morning, the house stood quiet, smoke rising from the chimney though no one had lit a fire. Those who passed by swore they heard whispering from inside, soft and rhythmic, like the sound of a girl's voice humming through the walls. The tar never cooled, the smell never left, and within days, the entire house began to rot from the inside out, as though what had happened there had poisoned the very wood. And even years later, when the structure finally collapsed, the earth beneath it remained blackened, untouched by grass, as if the fire that had devoured Clara Hensley was still burning just beneath the soil. Decades passed before anyone dared touch what was left of the Hensley farmhouse. Time had eaten away most of the wood, leaving only the stone chimney and the memory of what people called the girl who melted from the inside. Children whispered her name during storms, and grown men refused to walk the hill after dusk, claiming they could still hear faint crying in the wind. By the 1880s, the land had been sold 3 times, each new owner hoping to build something over the ashes, but the earth rejected every attempt. Foundations cracked, tools went missing, workers fell ill with fevers that burned for days and left them delirious. so the property sat abandoned, a haunted scar in the heart of Alabama. Then, in the summer of 1897, a group of laborers was sent to clear the remaining ruins for a new rail line. They laughed at the stories, dismissing them as backwoods superstition. But by the end of the first day, they stopped laughing. The ground beneath the old Hensley home was strangely soft, and the soil clung to their boots like tar. The closer they dug toward where the bedroom once stood, the heavier the air became, thick with that same metallic scent no one could name. By the third day, they hit something hard beneath the dirt. Not stone, not wood, but something smooth, like glass. They brushed away the soil and uncovered what looked like a hollow shape, delicate and curved. One of the men struck it lightly with his shovel, and the sound it made wasn't that of rock, but a faint, brittle chime. As they cleared more of it, their laughter returned, though this time uneasy, until the shape became unmistakable. The form of a small body, curled as if asleep. The figure was encased in a thin, translucent shell that glimmered when the sun hit it, as though frozen mid-breath. Beneath that glass layer lay bones, perfectly preserved, the skull small and fine-boned, the teeth still intact. But what unsettled them most was the face, or rather the faint imprint of one. The glass seemed to hold an expression beneath its surface, a trace of agony twisted into a silent scream. One of the men swore he saw movement, a shimmer that passed through the clear layer as if something still pulsed beneath it. They dropped their tools and backed away, unsure if what they had uncovered was human at all. The foreman sent for the county coroner, who examined the remains and claimed it was impossible for such preservation to exist. The heat and humidity of Alabama should have reduced any body to dust decades ago. He ordered the skeleton transported to town, but the men refused to touch it barehanded. Even through gloves, they said the surface felt warm, not like sunlight, but like skin. That night, when they tried to move it, one of the lanterns tipped and shattered. The flame caught the dry grass instantly, spreading fast. They fled, watching from a distance as the fire devoured what was left of the ruins. By dawn, the blaze had burned itself out, leaving only a shallow pit of ash. But when they returned to inspect the site, the glass shell was gone. Not broken, gone. No fragments, no residue, no sign it had ever been there. Only a small black scorch mark in the earth shaped like a handprint pressed deep into the soil. In the years that followed, people continued to find strange things near the hill. Melted patches of glass, bits of metal fused into the dirt, and once a ring that had belonged to Elias Hensley discovered perfectly intact, yet hot to the touch. Locals said Clara's spirit still lingered, that she was bound to the fire her mother had awakened, her soul trapped somewhere between the living and the infernal. And when the wind blew just right across that cursed ground, some claimed they could hear a faint voice whispering through the trees, soft and desperate, as if still begging for someone to cool the fire that never died inside her. So if you've made it this far, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.